Hi, good afternoon. Welcome everyone. It's 3:20 here in London, and unfortunately, one of our guests is just having a few issues trying to get through his centralized privacy filter. But don't worry about that. Today's panel, we have Timo from Swarm Markets, I'd say the world's first fully licensed decentralized exchange. You can correct me if I'm wrong. And then we have Tim from Minerva Chambers, a barrister, and been working in this field for the last 4 years. And hopefully, just shortly along, we should have Graham from Archex as well. But if we just get started on the on decentralized versus centralized. So, Timo, you obviously have a view on this with Swarm Markets. I'd let you start.
Yeah, I think when this innovation came along, I think like we've been following this space like even since Bancor and Ether Delta, IDEX, when all the early kind of projects came along and kind of following it with interest, but then only really kind of got committed to it. I would say in 2019 when we decided to go for this regulated setup, which then led into 2020 when like DeFi summer kind of took off and obviously proved that this is a big thing, right? So, but just kind of going back to the rationales of why DeFi is a good thing or decentralized exchange is a good thing in the first place, it does solve a number of things that I think were challenging in kind of the more centralized structures, such as like self-custody was one of the things that we valued very highly. And we just saw that that's like a huge plus point to be able to kind of decide how you want to custody your assets. And then also like the transparency around transactions themselves to actually really know what's going on the network directly and to be able to verify everything. We think that's a huge deal. And then also like beyond that, we also saw that because regulation was gradually creeping in and kind of starting to nudge some of the existing DeFi platforms around the edges, we saw that there was an opportunity to provide something that would serve maybe a slightly different audience with a regulated DeFi exchange, but certainly to still kind of get the benefits of like that architecture, and where, well, I should add also like obviously composability being one of the key elements as well, so that once you have like self-custody, transparency, and composability, then you have something that's like truly differentiated from a centralized setup, and that's where we see a lot of potential.
Yeah, it's strange because I suppose it's natural to think that that it's on either side. Like decentralized is completely, not in line with the law, but you've obviously shown the opposite. Tim, what's your take on regulation coming into trying to tackle DeFi, and as opposed to the current hurdles that even the centralized exchanges are facing, trying to get license in their local jurisdictions?
Yeah, I think that the current centralized exchanges are having to go through pretty significant hurdles to get the licenses they need. And then you've obviously got the likes of Swarm who've done very well to get the license they've got, but they are certainly in the minority at the moment. I think that the sort of the move will be a gradual shift towards entities looking for licenses in the jurisdiction that they choose that suits them best, depending on the level of scrutiny they want from regulators. So you're likely to see some choosing the lighter touch end of the market, and some preparing to go for full-on licenses in jurisdictions where they'll have much more than the normal kind of basic KYC, but they'll be looking at the systems of controls, they'll be looking at sort of senior management, they'll be looking at the tech as well. And it really will depend on which level of scrutiny the projects want.
And the FATF, they cite jurisdictional arbitrage as one of the kind of key risks that are facing virtual assets and trying to regulate the space. The way that we look at it, it's obviously we're trying to overcome these hurdles. I mean, Timo, how did you go about choosing which jurisdiction? Were there open invitations from certain jurisdictions, or was it a case of trial and error?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there was So there was not an open invitation per se initially. I think when Germany, it was, to pretty much everybody's surprise, I think that Germany would take a step forward and say, here's how we view, the activity of holding custody of crypto assets. And then they kind of came up with the legislation to follow. And then they, specified the process through which you could apply for a license. So I think, I think there was an invitation from Germany for sure, especially with regards to custody. What most people didn't do was to also apply for trading of cryptocurrencies and securities at the same time, which is what we did. So I think that was kind of maybe a unique situation for us. But rolling back to let's say 2018, the way that we arrived at that conclusion was we were in Silicon Valley building, a security token issuance platform, and we realized that liquidity is obviously one of the main reasons why people would tokenize an asset in the first place. So, and just kind of realizing that the US regulatory environment would probably not allow an exchange to kind of create something that was fully decentralized or that was created outside of the traditional kind of, ATS structures, which is kind of the US corresponding structure to an MTF in Europe. And we just saw that, Open Finance and T0, very well-funded projects, didn't really get through with something that was workable in the US market. So, in 2018-19, when we both moved across to Europe, we basically traveled across and tried to have conversation with a number of different regulators across Europe, obviously FCA in the UK, and then, went to Malta, Estonia, Jersey, all kinds of places, and tried to figure out what's the best place. And in the middle of that process, that's when Germany kind of came around with this legislation, and it just became a no-brainer at that point.
That's and Tim, just on the topic of FATF, with the latest updated guidance on virtual assets, peer-to-peer transactions and the kind of money laundering risks and how to kind of tackle them. Do you see much kind of clarity in this updated guidance on what's on how jurisdictions and the private sector themselves, or the so-called operators of the DEXs or DApps can tackle these?
I think that obviously you're right about their concern about jurisdictional arbitrage, and there will be moves to sort of level the playing field, but there'll always be sort of jurisdictions that entities can go to which aren't necessarily FATF members. The other thing to keep in mind is that this legislation is taking time to filter through and has to be implemented by the various member states as well, and that's going to take time. And I think what you're going to see in the meantime is solutions which, in a sense, move ahead of where the legislation is. So they're moving ahead of the strict regulatory requirement, and try to find ways to give the same level of protection, say for around KYC, as you might get once the legislation comes through. So you're seeing some of the zero knowledge proof solutions. I think Ident3 is well known in that space for developing that kind of a solution, and I guess what you'll end up with is the solutions being there before the legislation comes through, and then the solutions will need to make sure that they are in compliance with the legislation when it starts to kick in. Now, of course, you can say that some of the legislation is already there, the Fifth Money Laundering Directive, etc. So there is some shape, but the extent to which FATF start to bring in additional requirements around the travel rule, etc., solutions will need to catch up with that and make sure that they remain in compliance with the new legislation as well.
And travel rule was a huge topic. Since last year, I remember when I joined CoinFirm, the issues with trying to cover that topic. And anytime someone searched for it, they were just getting rules on travel because it was about COVID restrictions. But how are people actually tackling this right now? And we're starting to see a few solution providers trying to put things together, as are we, with some partners. But are there actual inklings of how to actually do this? And is anyone actually has anyone achieved it, Tim?
I think that I've seen some solutions which apparently work and they would be in compliance. I think that the difficulty is not quite knowing how the legislation will land, so you can't say completely that they will be. But I think most of the large actors pretty swiftly started trying to find a tech solution, and often in conjunction with various other actors, so they worked on it together. So I think there are solutions out there. I think it remains to be seen whether they are exactly in compliance when the legislation gets properly settled. I see we've just gotten Graham joining.
Awesome.
Sorry about that. I had to bypass the firewalls. I'm sorry.
No problem, Graham. Well, Graham, thanks for joining. If you just give us a quick intro, obviously we all know much about Archax, but if you just take it away, and in terms of, we don't want to go just a pure centralized versus decentralized, because it's never, there's never pure black and white. But with Archax, what are you hoping to achieve now that you're FCA licensed and regulated and so forth?
Yeah, hi Sachin. Thanks for having me, and sorry I'm late, everyone. My name's Graham, CEO, co-founder of Archax. We're an FCA regulated digital securities exchange, custodian and broker, and have the UK crypto assets registration as well. And on the, I guess diving straight into the question, on the face of it, we're very much centralised at the moment. And the reason mainly being that regulations almost require it at the moment. It's quite hard to have a decentralised venue, certainly in the regulated space. But that doesn't mean that we don't believe in a decentralized future. I'm almost acutely aware that we're probably here as the centralized exchange, but we talk often about everything that can be in the decentralized, everything that's happening in the DeFi space right now. How can it apply to regulated markets? And it's definitely the future, but just working out how you can achieve it with the necessary controls and processes in place so actors and regulators have comfort. That's the challenge, and that's the journey that we're going on, and we're trying to work with the regulators on that journey as well.
Awesome. And Timo, how did you find choosing or applying for FCA regulation and getting registered? Is it just completely?
Sorry, you mean Buffin, Germany?
No. Yeah, I know you did. I know you're registered there, but with the UK, is there any reason why?
So it was actually a very kind of early decision by us to kind of avoid that, because we understood pretty quickly that they were looking at replicating more or less the structure that the US had advocated, which is exactly what Graham described. You kind of have to be a full stack of everything in order to comply with the regulation. And that was something that we decided we did not want to. That was the path we decided not to go down, because it was just like. And all kudos to you, Graham, for doing it. I think it's excellent that you're through that now. I know it's been a long struggle for you as well. And we started this process in 2019 in Germany, and I think you potentially have been doing it for longer with the FCA. So I think it's it is a struggle to get through that process, but at the same time, there's a lot of benefit on the other side. I mean, of course. To some degree, you have to build an ecosystem which is maybe slightly different from the perspective of even composability in DeFi. We have to think about who do we connect with and why, and how can we make sure that all the participants that are in that ecosystem have been qualified at the same level as to our requirements, because that's the only way to build this from a kind of a reg standpoint. And then we're hoping that at some point we'll be able to do more and more crossover into open DeFi. But then, once that happens, we would need to know that, all the kind of the AML features and checks are implemented on those platforms as well, so that there can be a more, let's say, a freer flow of assets between the different platforms. And then in order to basically get full benefit from composability, which is really to me, it's that's one of the bigger game changers, that you build something once and then other people can build on it. And it just becomes this fantastic, innovation in the end.
Awesome. Tim, with your clients and with your experience with the private sector, what regions have you seen as being a growth sector for applying for to start your crypto asset business, apart from Europe?
Well, it's interesting. It's particularly interesting to see Graham on and the journey he's gone through, which I know has been sort of watched closely by others. I mean, to be totally frank, over the last 3 or 4 years, I've been really, really hesitant to advise people to go, the FCA route. And it's not just because of the obvious lack of legislative framework to look at, but also the moment you've got two main problems. If you put a foot wrong, you suddenly are exposed to regulatory action, which is concerning. But also you are in a space where you're competing with others who will not have the same constraints, and they can move very fast. And Graham can speak to it far better than me, but I imagine the extent to which you might want to take actions or do particular things, you do have to go through various checks and sign-offs before you can do that when your competitors aren't. So I think it is a very tricky area to have gone through. But then, obviously having done it, you've now got the licenses and you're in some ways at an advantage. And it is that sort of balancing out. In terms of those jurisdictions, I think the way I see it is, obviously there's a lot of jurisdictions everyone will be familiar with. I think the BVI is extremely popular and makes a lot of sense for a lot of reasons for many projects, because the law is recognizable, it's relatively clear, it applies. You can get some regulatory feedback if you need it. So I can see that happening, and I guess the thing it often comes back to for me is, once you've established somewhere and you've got your either your license or you've got comfort you're outside of a regulatory perimeter, your only real restriction at that point is how do you then market, because you may be doing activities which require you to market into a jurisdiction, and if you've got the license there or potentially somewhere down the line, you rely on something like passporting if when the European legislation comes through, that gives you opportunities. But provided you're not breaching UK equivalent of financial promotion rules in a jurisdiction, you can sit somewhere offshore, have the B fleet afoot, and you can offer these services, provided people find you, or you can market to them without breaching these local requirements. So to me, that was always the trade-off, and it was something clients explored, and obviously some chose to go down the BaFin or the FCA route with the right results. But I imagine I know others in that time really focused on the tech development and didn't put those efforts and time and money into the licensing. It was a decision they made.
Yeah, just maybe a pure speculative question here to you all. What kind of vested interests do governments have between each other when they're competing for trade? Is there any? Can you maybe provide some speculation as to why some jurisdictions are more open to these kinds of advancements? I can open that up to anyone who's brave enough.
I was going to say tax, but there may be more better insights than that. To me, it would be if you can get entities to set up in a jurisdiction, you can capture the tax revenue. And that's why I'm so shocked and surprised that the UK, especially with Brexit, has really not taken the opportunity to look what's coming down the pipeline at the European level in terms of legislation, and to be frank, how relatively over the top and intrusive it is, and tried to develop a much more attractive regime, and in a sense set the City of London up for the next 20 years. But there may be other views other than tax.
I can agree more with Tim. I can't believe that we've almost got a perfect situation of Brexit. Not that I thought it was a perfect situation, but now we're in Brexit. We're a financial services hub. We're one of the fintech leaders of the world, and we've got an opportunity to create rules that can be good controls and processes for institutions, but encourage innovation in the UK. And actually, they almost do the opposite at the moment. Tim was exactly right. It's somewhat easier to set off offshore and sell into the UK. So you're not protecting UK consumers, and you're pushing all innovation and tax offshore. So it's not even neutral at the moment. It's actually pro offshore. And when we went through our application process, actually, the FCA felt like they were ahead of the game to me. They released a good consultation paper a few years ago on crypto. They developed different categories nicely. And actually, our application process, given that we were doing something innovative, was fairly straightforward. But the crypto asset registration has been a bit of a problem since then. I think it's pretty unclear. There's hundreds of companies that are going through registration. There's some of the most complex companies to come out of recent years. And, the FCA have got an uphill battle there to to try and approve them all. So it does feel like we put a foot wrong. It doesn't feel like still that we've got support for the UK to get there. But the new generation is really a decentralized one. And frankly, the UK will have no competitive advantage. People will build what they can build quickly with the support of their government and regulators. So I think that's the case. Just one thing I would say in terms of the incentives, is that the regulator is paid by size of firm in terms of the fees that they're able to levy against the companies. So if you've got large financial institutions, they actually contribute a significant amount of money into the regulator, whereas new companies are less able to get that foothold. So we have a struggle in the UK with even getting bank accounts for small innovative crypto funds. So even getting off the ground at a grassroots level is a challenge. So I wouldn't say the incumbents are defending their position, but they certainly have a monumental advantage over anyone trying to enter.
Yeah, I mean, I can add my view to that, which is, I don't think the arbitrage is always that important, because it's like the way we thought about it was like, if we want to go after a certain category of clients to be using our platform, then we just think that being in Germany as a jurisdiction qualifies us to address that segment, whereas being potentially somewhere else wouldn't qualify us to address that segment. So I think it's like, it comes down to actually making a choice of like what kind of business you want to build. And then that drove our decision for sure. And then, like Tim said, there's been like aspects of this market that's been obviously developing much faster outside some of these, let's say, more recognized regimes, or even like unlicensed structures that have been like growing very rapidly. But at the same time, it's not the same kind of company that you're building, right? And in some cases, it's not even a company because it's the DAO. So it's just different, right? And we just saw an opportunity in doing something in this structure the way we're doing it. And just coming maybe back to commenting on the UK situation, even us being in Germany with that foothold, and we think that that's a great place to be, we're spending a lot of time in the UK because it is in fact like the financial center of Europe, and all like a lot of the partner conversations, a lot of the investor conversations, a lot of the activity is centered around London still. And that's not going to change like very quickly. So I think there's still, obviously hope for the UK to kind of, retain that, hub role within Europe, even if we're not at this point in time registered there or licensed there.
Yeah, just picking up on.
Sorry.
I was just going to say, just one of the things Tim said just now as well about, kind of Archax, we made our choice and we climbed the regulatory mountain. And I guess a lot of companies, they innovate first with technology and produce some amazing things. And, companies like Ether Delta, back in the day with Decentralised Exchanges, Shapeshift with no AML KYC, and eventually they have to move. But they can gain significant traction and commercial, commercial revenues from launching early with the technology and wondering about regulations later. And you're already seeing it in, on things like Solana with Serum, really powerful decentralized exchanges emerging. And I don't think the teams are really sitting there saying, should we be regulated or not? I mean, they're probably having the question, but it's very much lead with innovation and then work out how to fit it in the regulation. So there's that's a really innovative model that we take inspiration from. But our view is that we kind of don't want a regulatory slap on the wrist at any point in time, because that would be a real issue for institutions when they come to market. So ours is a slightly longer game, appreciating the innovation but being very cautious. And I guess theirs is just in a different place on the risk return frontier, I guess.
Well, also I think it actually presents quite a challenge to kind of backfill the regulatory aspects in the aftermath, because in my view, that's much more complicated to do. Like if you go out on a limb and innovate too much in one direction, and then you're trying to kind of backpedal that into a reg environment, it's actually quite difficult to do that without potentially, getting a lot of pushback from your community or your users. I think that happened potentially to Shapeshift to some degree. And there's been examples of that, I think, that shows that if you go too far out on kind of on a limb, and then you try to backpedal that into a reg environment, then it does present a lot of challenges as well. And what you've built can actually partially be eroded by that process.
Yeah, on the vested interest point, I think that you've got the vested interest potentially from governments looking across to their competitors, but you also have to keep in mind the existing legacy sector, and I think what they will look to when they see the technology and what it brings is a real concern that, if you've got an exchange or an exchange and a clearing structure in the legacy world, you've got all the settlement banks that support it, you've got the various custodians, you've got the prime brokers, and God knows what else in part of that structure. And each of them takes a little piece of the pie. And in the event of an insolvency, you add another level of complexity to unwind it all and figure it all out. If you suddenly replace that with atomic swap settlement between one or two entities, you suddenly see why regulators see we've got the infrastructure, we know how to regulate this, we know how to we know where we've seen MF Global, Lehman, etc. We've seen where it all can go wrong, and we can deal with that. We're now bringing in competitors which remove about 3 or 4 of those actors from the equation, and they're bringing in risks we haven't ever had to test, we haven't ever had to analyze or regulate. And at the same time, by removing those actors from the equation, we are also removing either our regulatory fees or a big chunk of our tax revenue to our particular financial sector. So they've got to somehow transition, and I think the incumbent actors know that this is coming, because I know for a fact they're looking very closely at a lot of these technologies and very worried about what it means because they've actually got the licenses and what these technologies actually mean for their established positions in the market. So I think that the regulators are trying to sort of balance the need to maintain their tax revenues, to maintain their understanding and their control over the sector, because they know where the risks are to a degree, and bringing in a new sector which they must know is going to replace the existing sector in the next 10, 20 years, at least in terms of technology, but do it in a way that is orderly and in a way that somehow manages to not totally disrupt the established position. And I think that's the difficulty they've got. Whether they frame it like that, I very much doubt. And maybe some people in the Treasury in London are thinking of it like that. But I think when you break it down, that's the challenge they've got. And I think that our challenge, I suppose, if you sort of say it from our side, is trying to assist regulators and policymakers in gradually moving towards that in a way which gives them the comfort and that they need to have, both to protect their tax position, but also to protect the orderliness of the markets they're regulating.
Yeah, I think, Tim, and on your point there about how well integrated everything is, and it's a bit of the reason why our journey took so long. If you look at a crypto exchange, they're your custodian, your broker, your risk engine, your exchange. It's all in one place. You try and do that with digital securities, for example, and you go, okay, is the security a share? You have to look back at company's law. Do I need to issue share certificates? Do I not? Okay, if I wanted to trade on a secondary market, I need to register it as CSD. Is there such thing at the moment as a digital CSD? No, there's not. Is there a clearinghouse? Okay, there's not. So I have to register as an internalized settler with the Bank of England. There's all these steps you have to go through. So part of the reason our job has taken so long is we wanted to build a secondary market. We've had to actually expand our offering to make sure that we satisfy all the regulations around us. It just is, it's very difficult to unpick it all. But of course, we can all sit here and go, okay, I'm going to spin up a decentralized securities exchange. And if you just ignore all of it, you can actually get quite a lot of traction, quite a lot of innovation, generate a lot of inspiration for people like me. But ultimately, it's probably going to, to Timo's point, you're probably going to have a bit of a slap on the wrists and maybe be in a bit of an irrecoverable position if you're not careful.
Yeah, agreed. And I think the right way to approach it is from our end, we obviously start with the bearer instruments, the kind of no-brainers, because there's no real conflict into that legacy structure. But then once you start doing tokenized securities, like you say, you have to do it in a way which is still conducive with the existing structures, because there is no kind of replacing that overnight. I think you're right, Tim. That's going to take whatever 10 to 20 years to replace. And you can't just build something that's going to immediately replace it, because that's not really realistic. And I think the regulators would be much concerned about how to kind of safeguard all the different kind of things that could go wrong in such an architecture, and it takes some time for them to wrap their heads around it. So I think that's going to take time. And the thing that we're doing now is the initial steps are more kind of related to doing synthetic products with with a backing of underlying assets, which could be then publicly traded stocks or some other type of asset. And I think that's a very different thing than kind of replacing natively the whole architecture of how securities are traded. But
Yeah.
it does it does bring like another universe of assets into the crypto space, which hasn't really been there before, and you can only do that if you're licensed.
Yeah, and I guess the flip side for the entities which haven't gone the route you've gone, and they've decided to sit offshore and be innovative, is somewhere down the line they may be thinking we need to come onshore, and have we done anything in the last 3 or 4 years which will make that difficult? Have we been aggressively marketing into a jurisdiction when we ought not to have been, or similar things like that? And they need to become comfortable that nothing they've been doing will make those applications, should they have to come in onshore in due course, problematic.
Yeah, one of the things that we're seeing actually is, because I often focus on whilst we're technically a private market traded publicly, one of the big places where decentralized exchanges look like they're going to get more traction is in the private market space, especially around bilateral transactions of private shares that are more easy to be able to be replicated on a blockchain and traded on an exchange bilaterally. And DTCC yesterday, I think, announced that they're starting to work on private markets as well. And Paxos in the US are working on a lot of the decentralized ways of building the traditional rails. So I think, the public space is a lot harder to get to, but the private market, which is a lot bigger, seems to be getting a lot of traction at the moment, just because there are fewer regulations in place which kind of inhibit the innovation.
All right, I think we might have lost Sachin, actually. I think potentially we are past our time frame. Yes, it seems like so. Well, whoever wants to orchestrate the end.
I think we lost him. We can sign off.
Great, guys.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks very much for your time. Thanks, Sachin.
Thank you. Bye.